But first, the Liberal Party has grown a spine and decided its position on the voice to Parliament. Now, I think we more or less expected that they would oppose it, but at least a line has now been drawn in the sand. The Nationals, of course, made their position clear some months ago. It would be somewhat embarrassing if the coalition partners couldn't come to an agreement on an issue as important and fundamental to the governance of the nation as this one. But this gives the No campaign the backing they need to get serious. And if you actually look beyond the headlines we keep reading about polling, the odds should now be in their favour. Polling in The Australian today, of course, showed that if a referendum was held today, it would clear the double majority required for constitutional change, which is that not just the majority of Australians vote for it, but also the majority of states. The one state that isn't in favour is, unsurprisingly, Queensland, and Western Australia only just provides support at 51%. Then you move on to 55% in New South Wales and Tasmania, 56% in Victoria, and interestingly, 60% in South Australia. Now, there are a couple of things to note here. The interviews for this polling were done between February 1 and April 3. So there's a significant number of people surveyed who would not have yet known the question that would be taken to a referendum, and obviously the subsequent fallout over the last couple of weeks. And according to this poll, about 8% of Australians are still undecided. People who are undecided about the voice are not people who will be voting on principle. Now, I, and I'm sure many of you at home, are opposed to the voice on principle because we don't like the idea of Australians being divided by race in the Constitution, and we don't like the idea of particular races of people having more say in legislation than anyone else. For us, there's really no version of the voice, whether it's in the Constitution or otherwise, that we would support because we're opposed to the entire concept of the voice. And there are obviously people who support the concept of the voice on principle as well, and their argument, and this is basically the language that's been used by people like Noel Pearson and Linda Burney, is that the voice would not divide but unite because it would help right wrongs of the past. Now, because both of these groups have formed their view on principle before practicality, they're not going to be swayed. And I believe that opposition to the voice is more likely to be based on principle than support is, which means that there is a significant number of people who like the idea of a voice to Parliament, but are still invested in the practicalities of what that would mean, which is why the No campaign should not be disheartened by polls like the one we saw today. 8% of people are currently undecided. Now, they will all be people who are worried about the flow-on effects of the voice and those who haven't yet seen enough detail to secure their support. Now, if just half of that 8% decides to vote no, WA would fall and Tasmania and New South Wales would come perilously close. Only one more state would need to fall and a double majority would be finished. And then you have people who are currently in the yes camp, but on the fringes, those who are inclined to support the voice, but still have misgivings around the lack of detail and the possible consequences. I am firmly of the view that they are large in number and that an effective No campaign can turn enough of them around to defeat the referendum. A Resolve strategic poll for the Sydney Morning Herald in February found 63% of people want more information on what is being proposed. That included 56% of Labor voters and 58% of Greens voters. The only extra detail we've had since then is the wording of the referendum question. And that bit of extra information led people who've supported and worked on the voice, like constitution law expert Greg Craven, to say we are going down a dangerous road. And pretty much all the polling we've seen in the last 6 months has shown a gradual decline in support for the voice. The SMH's polling, asking people how they would vote if they were forced to vote today, has slipped from 64% support in September to 57% last month. And their polling when people are given the choice to say they are undecided has dropped from 53% to 46% in the same period. Now, the campaign should be pretty simple. If you don't know, vote no. and the government is handing the No campaign their material on a platter. This was Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's response to criticism from legal experts that the Voice would open up High Court litigation.
I'm confident on the basis of people like the former head of the High Court, Justice French. He might know something about the Constitution. I just read out the third clause that makes it clear that the Parliament is primary.
But this was Attorney General Mark Dreyfus on Insiders 2 weekends ago.
Will it be able to go to the High Court, point to the words in the Constitution that say they may make representations to executive government and make a case that they have not been heard?
That's a possibility.
So which is it? The Parliament is primary, or High Court cases are a possibility? Then when the Prime Minister was asked a week and a half ago whether the Voice to Parliament would be able to provide advice on things like foreign policy and the climate safeguard mechanism, this was his snarky response.
Is this something you can imagine a Voice providing advice on, and would a Voice provide advice to the Greens as they would the government, or is it purely for legislation like this? How would that work?
Of all the very strange questions I've been asked about the Voice, that's up there.
But this is what Foreign Minister Penny Wong told the UN's General Assembly in New York last September.
The new Australian government is determined to make real progress on the national journey of healing with Indigenous Australians, the first peoples of our continent. And as Foreign Minister, I am determined to see First Nations perspectives at the heart of Australian foreign policy.
The contradictions abound, and this is ultimately what will bring the Voice undone. Albanese might be hoping to coast on the vibe, but there's only so long that can last. People will ask questions. They are asking questions. Even Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk today said people deserve more information, saying the federal government really needs to be a lot more proactive, as well as First Nations people, in terms of explaining what it means. I think people are after the detail, and I can understand there would be some hesitancy, and what it is, basically people wanting more information. Now, some have tried to argue that opposing the Voice is basically a lose-lose situation for Dutton and the opposition. If the referendum wins, they have egg on their faces for being out of step with Australia, and if it loses, Dutton will be blamed. But that, quite frankly, is nonsense. Sure, if the referendum wins, then the opposition will have failed in their quest, but you can't make sound decisions on the basis of what you think people will support. You have to take a principled stance, even if that sometimes doesn't win popular support. No government or opposition wins the argument 100% of the time. There'd be no opposition at all if that were the case. And if the referendum failed, then it would simply prove that the opposition was in step with the national mood. And yes, some people will try to blame Dutton for the loss, but it won't be his fault. If the referendum fails, it will be the fault of an arrogant, self-serving Prime Minister who took the idea of a voice to the people too early, without enough information, because he wanted to cement his place in history as a reforming PM, a 21st century Gough Whitlam, if you will. And that is a real possibility. Today should be a call to the No campaign. They are still very much in the game. And a calm, sensible picking apart of the detail is what is needed to win the fight.